This video will show you how to remove the front and rear suspension on 2009 through 2014 F-150s.
All right, so the first step in our uninstall, with your truck in the air and a wheel removed, we're gonna start by removing 2 bolts that hold brackets for lines on the side of your knuckle. So starting out, we have a 10mm bolt right here that holds on your brake line. We're gonna grab a 10mm socket and remove this. Then you can remove the bracket out of that little hole there on the tab. Next up, we have an 8mm bolt here, so with an 8mm socket, go ahead and remove this. Now both of these lines should be free of the knuckle. Next up, we're going to remove the 21mm nut that holds on your outer tie rod to your knuckle. With your 21mm socket, go ahead and get this removed. Now if it doesn't want to come out right away, what I'm going to do is thread this nut back on a little bit to protect the threads, and then we'll tap it on the side here to release it. All right, now we're moving on to the underside of the vehicle. We're gonna do 2 different things, starting with disconnecting the nut for the sway bar end link. Now you can remove the entire end link, or you can just disconnect one side and that will disconnect your sway bar. Go ahead and grab an 18mm socket and remove it. All right, now we're moving on to the back of our caliper. Now we do need to remove the caliper as well as the rotor to have access to our knuckle. So what we're gonna do is get to the back of the caliper bracket itself with a 21mm socket and remove the bolts. Now another helpful tip here is while you're separating the caliper from the rotor, throw a lug nut on there just to hold the rotor in place so it doesn't come off with the caliper. From there you can either wiggle the caliper off, or if it's very, very tight, you can use a pry bar and pull back on the brake pads in order to release them. Once your caliper is off, grab a caliper hanger or a similar tool, even some wire will work, just to take the tension off the brake line and hang it up. All right, now we can take our lug nut off, and as you can see, the rotor is free. Now if it's not, you can tap on the backside here with the rubber mallet, but since ours is already free moving, we can just slide it right off. We'll also be removing this dust shield just so it's out of the way. It's 3 8mm bolts, so go ahead and grab an 8mm socket and get this removed. And now we'll also remove this sensor from the knuckle as well. This is a 5mm Allen, so grab a 5mm Allen key or Allen socket and remove this bolt. Now you can wiggle out the sensor and hang it off to the side. Next up, we're moving to the back of the knuckle. We're gonna pull off the vacuum line. And on the larger port, we're gonna place the line for our vacuum pump. Now we're gonna pull about 20 pounds of vacuum in order to release the 4-wheel drive actuator so that we can pull the axle out. At this point, we need to remove the dust cover for our axle nut to expose the axle. And make sure we still have vacuum pulled, but with a 13mm socket, we're gonna remove the axle nut. Now at this point we can release the upper ball joint by removing the nut. Just gonna throw a pry bar in there, just as a precaution, in case it releases as soon as we loosen this nut. I have a 21mm socket here, as well as a swivel to get a proper angle on it. Go ahead and remove this as we push down on the upper control arm. Now because it didn't release, we will now have to tap it right here until it does. Just leaving this bottom nut on a few threads to be able to loosen it by hand. That will protect the threads and will keep the upper control arm from completely releasing. Now with a hammer, I'm gonna tap the side of the knuckle right up here until it releases. Putting our pry bar back in and prying down, we will now remove the nut and release the upper control arm completely. All right, now the last thing holding on our knuckle here is this nut on the lower ball joint. Now this probably will not release by just loosening the nut, but be prepared if it does release to not allow the entire thing to come down. Grab a 24mm socket and get this removed. Okay, so it is still attached to the ball joint here. It did not actually release, so we're gonna thread on this nut a little bit of the way. And then we're gonna hit the back side of this with a hammer until it releases. All right, so now that that is released, we can lift up on the knuckle. Make sure you are still pulling vacuum. And you can wiggle it loose and remove it. All right, now I did want to just show you guys why we pull this vacuum in order to pull this knuckle off. Again, you don't have to pull the knuckle, but it makes it a lot easier. So when we pull vacuum, you may notice the inside ring of this four-wheel drive actuator to move. Once we have about 20 pounds, it should be still, and then once I release this, you can see it go back to engaging. So when there's no vacuum, it's engaged. When you pull the vacuum, it releases, so you can remove this knuckle without damaging your four-wheel drive. All right, next up, we're gonna remove the large bolt that goes through the bottom of your strut. Now on the bolt side, we have a 27mm wrench, and on the nut side, we have a 30mm socket. Go ahead and get this removed. All right, so before we remove the nuts on top of the strut, I am just gonna pull this pop clip out just to give us a little more room on the far nut. We have a pop clip removal tool and we're just gonna pull it up and out. Next up, we have a 15mm ratcheting wrench. We're gonna start with the frontmost nut here. Go ahead and get it removed. Moving on to the far one, this one's just behind that one. Again, with your 15mm ratcheting wrench, go ahead and remove it. Now you can also use a 15mm socket and ratchet, you just have a little less room with that, which is why I like the ratcheting wrench. Now finally, we have one more nut here. We're gonna loosen this almost all the way but not remove it, so we can use it to hold our strut in while we remove the bottom portion. All right, now that it is just hand tight, we can start to remove the strut. All right, at this point we can pry down on our lower control arm to get our strut removed. I'm putting a pry bar in here and using the frame to pull down on the lower control arm. And what we're just gonna do is try to have this bottom part clear its bracket. And now that it's out, we can remove the last nut we have up top and remove it off the truck. All right, so we have our truck up on the lift here and we're supporting the axle. If you aren't on a lift, make sure you are still supporting your axle with some jack stands if you are working in your driveway. Next up, we're gonna remove the bolt from the bottom of the shock. Grab a 15mm socket and an 18mm wrench and get this removed. Now using a 21mm socket, we're gonna remove the 4 nuts on the bottom of the U-bolts. Go ahead and get these removed. Now we can remove the U-bolts. If this line is attached to one of your U-bolts still, just pop the clip off. You can do it by hand. And then remove both of your U-bolts. At this point, we can lower the axle down slowly until we can remove the factory block. Go ahead and lower it down. Pull your block up and remove it.
Thanks for watching, and remember, for all things Ford trucks, keep it here at AmericanTrucks.com.